So in the last part here, we're talking about barriers to trade. We've talked about the definition of multinational corporations, why understanding that is important. We just talked about modes of participation. Now let's discuss barriers to trade and then finish up with a case study assignment. All right, so the first thing is looking at barriers to trade. The biggest, from a marketing perspective, the biggest importance to us, the biggest issue is culture. Sports marketers have to understand the differences across and within national borders and how that affects our business partners. Examples of where culture plays into barriers of trade are listed here. We're going to go through each of them as we move forward. So let's start first with language. That's an example of language and culture is an example of something that can really impact us. Syntax, for example, how essentially the underlying meaning of wording and how we translate things is almost the most where you see most of the problems in marketing and communication. So, for example, if you take Puma and United Arab Emirates National Day, the situation was that the National Day is basically similar to Christmas time in the United States. There are festivals in the UAE. Puma, who has a market share or decent market share in the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, wanted to honor the day, wanted to do everything it can, and so they released a shoe called the Puma Speed Cat. The problems with that is that on the shoe, they developed it, had the same colors as the UAE flag. The colors are red, green, white, and black. And you'd think, okay, that's not a big deal. The problem was that Puma didn't really consult with any of their marketing staff or people in the UAE before producing the shoe, because the UAE culture believes that feet and shoes are dirty and unclean, and therefore Puma putting their flag on the shoe was seen as being an insult. And this may not be the case in other cultures, but this was something that was not foreseen, and you can see that being an issue in how their marketing implications affected them. So really the keys to this barrier is to know the language and know the culture that goes along with the language. Research the culture before introducing a good or a service. The second barrier to trade we want to consider is religion. Religion would be essentially any type of holiday, any Sabbath days or those holy days, prayer times, and any of these things from a basic standpoint can affect sporting event schedules. In the United States, in Texas specifically, there was a case, and you can look this up, and I believe I mentioned it later in the semester, a case with a Jewish school in Texas wanting to play in TAPS, which is the Texas Association of Private and Parochial Schools, in a basketball tournament. Yet they wanted to hold a game on the Sabbath. The school, because of playoff schedules, couldn't find another time to play it. They protested, but TAPS decided to forfeit. After protesting and it getting out in the media, they reversed their ruling and allowed them to play. That's just an example of how event scheduling can affect, or religion and event scheduling can have issues with one another. Apparel for different genders is often tied to the sport, and so some religions, especially religions that restrict the wear of women or us and men as well, affecting how they would go about wearing their clothing for certain events. So taking basketball or swimming or any of those volleyball types of activities, apparel can be impacted by religion. And some religions have different beliefs about physical activity. Some of them having, again, going back to gender, the mixing of sports between genders and having separate facilities. All of these things are things to consider when it comes to religion. Another barrier to trade is a local economy. This is less, some has impact on or impacted by culture, but the ability to, or the infrastructure of the country to be able to host events. So communication, transportation, energy facilities, financial systems. One of these things that impact it is their currency and exchange rate. Pricing can become an issue when you have fluctuating currency during sporting events. It also increases the risk of trade that's impacted by these exchange rates. And so corporations, multinational corporations and events don't want to make sure that the currency and the exchange rates are sound and are not fluctuating when they're holding events. It's again a barrier to trade. Could be. In other words, political and legal stability, or political stability and legal action. So political stability, so examples of this could be just look at the history of our Olympic Games. In 1936, the Olympics were held in Germany, where one of the lot of money that was spent on those Olympic Games, and many people probably believed at the time, ended up being correct, that it was seen as a propaganda game. Hosted by Hitler and the Nazi regime, was later be known as the Nazi Games. Other examples would be political systems, for example, what they've done in Russia in the last years when they hosted the Winter Games in Sochi, and any future events. We'll see how that plays out as well. But a lot of political stability is the question, and political aspects of it. One thing you want to do as you're talking about marketing of multinational events, and one thing the IOC does is during their bidding process, there are a lot of different variables that they look into. One of them being political environment. Is it a country that has positive relations with other countries around the globe? That is something that they look into before they select a host country. Legal considerations, for example, looking at U.S. firms abroad. What are the U.S. laws? Are there trade embargoes? Are there trade tariffs? Are there other types of legal restrictions between countries about the products that are being shipped, imported, and exported, or just restrictions altogether for that country? Are there other international regulations? So the European Union or the EU, the North American Free Trade Agreement, those are things that would be considerations of international regulations. And then laws of trade nations. So are there laws similar to that of the United States? These are all things that we want to consider when looking at political and legal environments. And so I mentioned trade restrictions. So tariffs. Tariffs would be taxes. Another word for taxes. They're surcharges or duties that are placed on imported goods. Typically, tariffs are not positive for trade relations. They're restrictions, which then limit that, and therefore various reasons, whether it be political or economic reasons. Revenue tariffs would be tariffs or taxes that are generating income for the government themselves. That's revenue tariffs, those that are generating income for the government themselves. But protective tariffs would be basically taxes that are raising prices in order to keep the imported goods, basically those that are being brought into the country, to keep them out so that domestic goods can be still competitive in price. So in other words, revenue goods are just trying to generate revenue for the organization, but protective tariffs would be those that are, you're trying to raise the price so that imported goods would be kept or keeping the domestic market competitive. Non-tariffs restrictions would be also known as administrative trade barriers. These will have things such as quotas or embargoes. Quotas would be those limiting the amount of goods that are being imported from a certain country or region, or just importing that type of good into the country over a given period of time. That's trying to keep that product stable throughout the country, either over a given period of time or within that region. Embargoes would be a total ban on trade with another nation. Up until a few years ago, the United States had trade embargo with Cuba. That is still being discussed. That right now it is typically has tariffs still, trade restrictions that are still placed on Cuba, but for a long time embargoes were a part of it until President Obama lifted that restriction. Okay, so all of these trade barriers, there's different ways that we can reduce them. Again, by reducing trade barriers, you're more likely to have increased revenue in your organization, ability to expand globally. And so I want to go through a few of these ways to reduce trade barriers. The first one is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or the GATT agreements. This was founded in 1947, and basically it's sponsored negotiations in order to reduce worldwide barriers to trade. The World Trade Organization, or the WTO, was established because of GATT, because of the GATT agreements, as a way to monitor the agreements between countries. And so the World Trade Organization monitors upwards of 150 GATT agreements between nations. Currently, the international economic communities, or the IECs, are essentially there to promote economic stability and cooperation within certain regions, and are there to rejuvenate through the reduction of trade barriers. And so it's working together in economic communities and geographical regions. And then there's common markets. And so common markets are examples of ways to reduce trade barriers and are typically regional. So common markets are basically gathering all the members from a geographical region and to rely on each other for trade between nations. And so the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, is an example of one the United States is in. That is between the North American countries, Mexico and Canada, and so on and so forth. The Central American Free Trade Agreement, or the CAFTA, is those of Central America. The European Union, which is actually the most recent one formed of all of these and most inclusive. The EU has been in the news in the past couple of years because of Brexit. The United Kingdom, or England, decided to leave the EU, which has caused some problems in trade barriers of themselves. And the last one is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the TPP, which has also been in the news as it relates to the United States and President Trump. So the last thing I want to talk about is a case study, and this actually you'll be doing on your own. What I want you to do as your assignment for this part is to choose a sport industry that related firm. So this could be a sport property or non-sport property in the sport industry, and determine these questions. First one is it a multinational corporation, and how are they involved in global expansion? Second one is I want you to identify the nations that are involved. And the third thing is to identify the barrier or barriers, if there are more than one, to trade for this country, for this company. And so again, identify the multinational corporation and how it expands globally, what nations are involved in their expansions globally, and then what barriers to trade between that company and its home nation, as well as the nations in which they're moving into.